Hey guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch Farm, and I'm here on this very bright and sunny day to talk to you about protecting your garden soil for winter. So you'll remember that last time we were at the farm, we were prepping our dahlia beds and we were mulching our lavender in preparation for incoming snow. Well, you can see most of that snow has now melted. It's a perfect time to go ahead and prep our soil for winter. Fall is not a popular time to be doing garden work. Usually we think of soil prep happening in the spring, but in the regenerative garden, it's really important to prep your soil for winter. Today at the farm, I'm going to give you my 3 favorite ways to prepare your soil for winter, to reduce erosion and to reduce nutrient loss and to help protect your soil life. Now, there are nuances to how we go about preparing our soil for winter. And a lot of that has to do with what was in the bed previously. Did we have annuals in that bed? Did we have perennials in that bed? Because we do treat our annual beds a little bit differently than we do our perennial beds. For our annual beds, my #1 choice for protecting the soil over winter is a cover crop. Now, we've discussed before how important cover cropping is in the regenerative garden. That's because it does a few things. It keeps living plant roots in the soil for longer, which means we're feeding our soil microbes for a longer period. It also brings biodiversity to the garden, especially if we're using a multi-species cover crop like we are here. And cover crops can also serve to create your soil fertility. So not only are we building organic matter by putting roots down into our soil that will break down, we're also putting nitrogen down into the soil by using a nitrogen fixing cover crop. These little white nodules here are a visual representation of the nitrogen getting fixated down and into the roots. So again, we're gonna leave this in the soil and this will break down, and in the spring, this will turn into nitrogen that the plants can use. Now, this bed previously was potatoes. So when we dug up all of those potatoes, we went ahead and cover cropped this. That happened in early September. So we have had almost 2 months of growth. Now, the temperatures during this growth period were up and down. So the growth was slower on this cover crop than it would be in mid-season, but we did still get growth. And you can see we got some nice ground cover from this cover crop. So not only is this going to help with erosion over the winter, that is, it's going to help keep our soil in place, it's also going to serve as a catch. So we also have some oats and some peas growing in here. Those oats are going to serve as an erosion preventer. So they're going to help keep the soil from washing away. Having roots in the soil is really good for that, especially if you've just had a root crop like potatoes or onions or dahlias and you've dug those up. That's a really good time to go ahead and put a cover crop in, because that soil is going to be loose from being turned over. Loose soil heading into winter means erosion of nutrients and erosion of the soil. So we want to try to hold that in place as much as possible. Now, this bed was all onions. And when we harvested the onions is when we went ahead and put in this cover crop. And we have all this tall growth because we had a multi-species cover crop in here. What cover crop you use, you have flexibility with that. Of course, we talk about this in our regenerative gardening course. So here we have a mix of buckwheat, we have oats, and we had peas. And actually, I think I see a little bit of hairy vetch in here as well. The buckwheat is not frost tolerant. So that's the stalks that you're seeing here. Once we get our first frost, the buckwheat is toast. But you can see what it's done in the meantime is it grew really quickly and it grew these nice big stalks. So as all the leaves are falling from the trees, these stalks help to catch these leaves, or we can put some leaves in if we don't have a tree nearby, and it's gonna help hold that mulch in place. Some other species in this cover crop, like the oats and the peas, aren't going to die until we get a solid ground freeze. These are more cold tolerant and they'll actually continue to grow until we get our frozen solid ground, which usually happens in January for us. So we'll get another couple good months of growth and living roots in the soil with a cold tolerant cover crop. Now, like we mentioned, even if we used a cover crop that dies off, it's helpful to have this residue on top of the soil to help with erosion and also to help hold some leaves in place. Here's how we do that. So one of the things that we do here at the farm is we do a leaf drop. And basically what that means is we go on our next door or our neighborhood Facebook pages and we ask everyone to bring us their leaves. So we usually get somewhere around 500 bags of leaves, and this is a really great thing because while we have trees, I like to let those leaves just fall on the ground and stay, because not only does that help our pollinators, it also helps with caterpillars, it helps overwintering insects, and that's not only helpful for our ecosystem here in the field, it's also helpful for our birds that tend to overwinter over here in our wooded habitat area. So the more caterpillars and things we have in the spring, the more likely we are to have birds, the less likely we are to have too many pests in the garden. So that means that I really rely heavily on donations of leaf bags from our community. Depending on how thick of a cover I'm able to get on my cover crop, I may or may not put leaves on top of this as well. Now with the cover crop that I want to winter kill, like these oats and peas, I want these ones to die over winter so that I don't have to manage them and deal with them in the spring. So that means I'm not going to mulch this, because if I mulch it, I might actually keep it alive by protecting the roots until spring, and then I'm gonna have to terminate it. I'm gonna go ahead and let the cold temperatures terminate this bed, but I am going to use leaves in beds where I don't have a cover crop growing. So you can see over here, this is actually our Lisianthus, and since we got our really cold temperatures, these have gone ahead and died off. Now we do mulch every year. If you haven't seen our mulch video where we go over our favorite mulches, you can go back and watch that one. But we had these Lisianthus mulched with pine needles. Now we have a pretty active soil life here, which means a lot of our mulch gets broken down really quickly, especially organic mulches. So I want to make sure that I'm protecting the soil with something over the winter. So this is my second choice. My first choice is always going to be a cover crop. Whenever I possibly can, I would prefer to have a cover crop protecting my soil, because the roots in the soil are very important. Much more important than just having something sitting on top of the soil is having those roots in the soil, feeding the soil microbes for as long as possible, and working the organic matter down and into the soil and capturing nitrogen. Lots of perks with cover crops. A good alternative though, in areas that we haven't been able to cover crop, is going to be these leaves. So I leave the plants in place. If they haven't had some kind of disease like powdery mildew, I'll just go ahead and leave these plants in place. There's really no reason for me to remove them. They're mostly gonna break down on their own over winter anyway. But what I will do to protect the soil, because the soil is pretty uncovered here, is I will use these leaves. I always get asked when it comes to leaves in the garden, are there kinds of leaves that you shouldn't be using? For example, black walnut leaves. The answer is I don't differentiate them myself. I will use whatever leaves are available, whatever leaves are brought to me. These actually look like honey locust, totally fine. Now, if it was all black walnut that you were applying every year and there was no biodiversity of the leaves, applying lots of black walnut over time could create minor issues in the soil. So I don't differentiate myself. I don't tell people you can't bring cottonwood, or you can't bring maple, or you can't bring black walnut. I just mix them all together and use them. This bag is heavy. I do a fairly healthy layer. Again, we get lots of leaves, so there's no shortage. There's no reason to skimp on it. So I'm just gonna go ahead and apply these to the growing beds themselves. Now in our walkways, we have mostly wood chip mulch. If I have areas that are thin, I'll usually top that off in the spring. But in the winter, I actually like to leave the paths, because in the spring, sometimes this will have broken down enough that I can actually use this on top of the beds. We actually are actively composting here in our walkways with the breakdown of organic matter, so sometimes we'll just scoop that up onto the soil. A lot of times people ask me about leaves blowing away, because these leaves can be lightweight, and especially if they're dry when you're applying them. Again, this is why I like to leave some plant residue here, because this is going to help keep them from blowing away. If you don't have plant residue left in your soil, if you had to cut it out, say that you had a lot of powdery mildew and you had a whole row of zinnias and you had to cut them down, we'll show you what to do for that next. All right, so here I am hanging out in some of the leaves that were donated today. So people just come and drop them off, and we take them in plastic bags, paper bags, whatever they have, because we just want to keep those leaves from going to landfill. So we put it usually out on Nextdoor or Facebook and just say, hey, bring us your leaves, we're gonna use them. So mulch, unmulch, whatever they wanna do, I don't care. The only thing I ever ask is that they are from untreated trees. So sometimes certain trees like ash in our area, we have the ash borer. And so sometimes people will treat their trees with pesticides, and we don't wanna use those ones to mulch. So that's usually the only thing we usually request, is that they don't give us any leaves that have been treated with pesticides. I'm gonna go ahead and get these loaded into the tractor so that we can show you how we use leaves if we have to remove the plant. So our zinnias up front looked really great until about the last 2 weeks when they all got powdery mildew. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut those and remove them. I'm gonna take them to the back. I'm gonna save a lot of the seeds. But for now, I'm gonna cut those out of the bed. So we'll show you how we protect our soil if we need to remove the plants. It is still a mess here. We still have our cement and our driveway taken out. They're actually gonna take down the brick and start getting our beams in tomorrow. So I'm really excited for that. We'll definitely keep you posted on that progress. For now, I'm just gonna load these leaves in here. We're gonna haul them up to our front beds and cover up that soil. If for some reason we do need to cut down the plants, like in this case, our zinnias got the powdery mildew, so we're gonna go ahead and remove them. We're just gonna cut them down at the base. I'm just doing this with hand clippers. If you have a bigger space like a market farm, you might wanna look into getting a bush hog to make it a little faster. Of course, we can't use a bush hog on a raised bed anyway. And you can see there's some things here like this nasturtium that's just very floppy. This wasn't diseased, I'm just gonna leave that on top of the bed. But there are benefits of leaving the roots in the soil, which is why I'm just clipping this down. We're still getting the organic matter down and into the soil by leaving the roots in the soil. Because powdery mildew is a disease that only affects the leaves, it doesn't actually reside in the root of the plant. It's safe to leave the roots in. But I am gonna remove most of the leaf matter because that powdery mildew can hang out on the leaves. And I'm not gonna compost this material because I don't reliably compost hot enough to know that I've killed the powdery mildew off and to not risk spreading it into my garden next year if I apply that compost to any of my beds. And I prefer to leave these plants in place if at all possible because it does provide a lot of habitat for overwintering insects, especially in the stems of the plants. But I'll even leave just a few inches of stems here, which will still be a place that insects are able to burrow down into. We're gonna apply a nice layer of leaves. This is gonna help insulate the soil from temperature extremes. It's also gonna help minimize any weeds that might blow in over the winter and in early spring. And it's gonna provide lots of habitat for nesting insects. Okay, I have my leaves down, but we're getting some winds today, so I'm gonna go ahead and put something over the top. I'm just gonna use these very simple metal T-posts. They have a little bit of weight to them. I'm just gonna place them over the top. Now, once we get enough humidity and moisture, these leaves will stay down very well. They'll kind of freeze together and form a mat over the top. But until that happens, these T-posts will help hold it in place. Now, perennials we treat a little bit differently. Some perennials like peonies like to be fully cut down every winter, and that will help prevent disease like botrytis. Other perennials, for example, our lavender, we like to mulch. It really depends on the plant. But we do something a little bit differently with most of our hardy perennials and our natives, so let's go check that out. So now we are over in the perennial area on the perennial side of the field. You can see we have mums here. In the last snow, these all got pushed over. I'm actually gonna push them back over to help protect the roots of these plants. Now, perennials, with the exception of things like the peonies that we cut down, we mostly treat like we do our annuals. So we leave as much of them in place as possible. Not only does that create a habitat for our nesting native pollinators and other insects, it also adds winter interest to the garden. So if we were to cut all of this down, it would look really boring in the winter, but because we leave a lot of this up, a lot of these seed pods dry, they drop seed, they spread that way, and they also create nice architectural interest in the winter, and the birds get to enjoy and eat a lot of the seeds. Now, some perennials that aren't quite as hardy, so for example, our cut florist mums, so these are, you can see, much taller in stem. These are the ones that flopped over here. These ones I might mulch, so they're about tolerant to a zone 5 or 6, which is what we are. But I don't usually use leaves if I'm mulching my perennials. Now here I have a pile of wood chips, and this is what I usually use around my perennial plants. The annual plants, those leaves that are going to break down, or a lot of them will break down by spring, I'll use those leaves because they're easy to clear away in the spring. So in the spring, if we still have a very thick layer of leaf mulch, I'll usually remove it so the soil can warm up and so that those plants can start to grow. But with our perennial plants, I usually like to leave the mulch in place. Here we have our golden currant, and this soil, the mulch has been broken down by the microbes and things in the soil here. So this soil is now bare. So I'm going to mulch with wood chips around my perennial plants because that's going to save me from having to do it every year, and it's also going to help enrich the soil underneath the mulch. I'm just doing a layer about 3 or 4 inches thick around these golden currants. The easiest thing to do to protect both your garden and the entire ecosystem, which is key in the regenerative garden, is just to leave as many plants in place as possible, especially if you've been growing native plants. Things like the anise hyssop behind me are going to provide excellent forage for birds over winter. We have our asters here, which are going to drop seed. And actually, even though it's November, we still have some bees foraging here on the nectar from these asters. Not only do these plants provide their own mulch, they drop their own leaves, they create their own protection for the soil around them, and they'll be just fine. Especially the natives don't really need extra mulch, although we will still usually protect the soil if there are bare spots, because I do see some cracking happening here. So you can see, especially down here in the walkway where we had some compacted soil, we do have some cracking happening here. So we do want to make sure that we go ahead and mulch this to help protect those soil microbes, especially if we see cracking happening in the soil. And then we'll be done. I actually have a few seeds still together. I see these Rudbeckia have a lot of seed on them, and we're trying to spread those into the backwoods. So I'm going to go ahead and get collecting some more seed. If you want to check out how we do that, make sure you go back and watch our video, our seed saving tour here at the flower farm. And I hope that this was helpful today and that you have a little bit more confidence moving forward in how to prep your garden for the fall. These bees, I can't believe it. Here it is November 2nd, and they're going to town. Asters, asters, told you. All right, guys, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, tune in next time, all that fun stuff. We appreciate you here at the farm, and we'll see you around here soon.